All right, I'm showing 12 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to the inaugural edition of the Noon Peanut Report. Our hope is that we do this once a month and that we keep things timely and we bring in guests that can speak on what's happening in the field, or in this case today, weed management. And we want to bring county agents in to talk about what's going on in their areas. We have a lot of ideas for this show, and I'll probably be looking to a lot of you guys too for ideas. We just want to keep it fresh and interesting and let the growers and the industry know what's going on. So today's episode, we have Dr. Todd Baughman, who I almost said is the new director, but he's coming up on his 1-year anniversary as the director of the Texas A&M AgriLife Research and Extension Center in Lubbock. So Todd, welcome back to Texas. Welcome back to the peanut world. We're glad you're here. And also on the show today is Dr. Pete Dotray, the Rockwell Chair of Weed Science, who has a joint appointment with Texas Tech University. Go Red Raiders! With Texas A&M AgriLife Research and Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. So this episode is going to be talking about weed management. Gosh, I've typed it 50 times. We're going to be talking about weed management today. So Todd and Pete, I'm going to turn it over to you guys and let y'all take it from here. And everyone, if you don't mind muting your audio, just in case your phone rings, or in my case, the dog barks. We'll mute, and then at the end, or feel free to ask questions too, but just unmute, ask questions if you want to ask questions. I'll be keeping an eye on the chat, so feel free to ask questions through the chat also. But I think we can be casual enough that if there are questions, I don't think Peter, Todd, either one would mind if you just interrupted, raise your hand, or just cut in a little bit and ask your questions. Are you guys good with that? All right.
Perfectly good.
Good. Let's get started. Todd, I'm turning it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Shelley. I'm really excited to be a part of this. We always are excited about our interaction with the Texas Peanut Producer Board and the tremendous amount of support that they provide our research and extension efforts within the Texas A&M AgriLife program. We couldn't do what we do without you guys and without your support. And we're very cognizant of that and very appreciative, and want to make sure that we're providing research and information that's relevant to you. So we're excited to be one of the first part of this first inaugural Noon Peanut Report. Excited to have Dr. Pete Dotray, obviously a resident expert in weed management in peanuts. And as we all realize, early season weed management is extremely important to get the crop started off correctly and to build and kind of set us up for our post-emergence program. So with that, Pete, I'll throw it to you and let you kind of start us off on your thoughts on where we need to start with our early season weed management.
All right. Well, very good. Well, thank you, Todd, and thank you, Shelley. I won't repeat too much to what's already been said, but I do appreciate this opportunity. I thank Shelley and the board, and I thank my friend and colleague and now boss, Todd, for thinking about weed management as a way to kind of kick off what this activity and what these future sessions are really all going to focus on. And that is, I hope to provide some useful, helpful information to growers that they can continue to be successful in their production systems. So Shelley mentioned we're going to have this be informal, and if I was standing up in front of a group, just like now I'm sitting and staring at my computer, I would like to emphasize that aspect. I'm going to make a few comments based on what I see. Some things are going to be maybe a little bit general. We can certainly be more specific. I'm really happy that Todd's a part of the call. I'm happy to see my friend and colleague James Gricker as a part of the call, and I'm sure there's a lot of other folks on this call that have weed management experience that also can contribute to some of the discussion. So I guess I'll just first kind of kick it off with maybe just some principles of weed management before we get into some specifics. I think it's always important as we kind of start a new year and focus on a new crop is to think about what the weed potential may be in the field that we're now moving into, because I think knowing the weeds that we're trying to control and certainly understanding the herbicide options that we have and try to put them in the very best light that we can is a really good start to what I hope is going to be an effective weed management system that we can put in place that will work from start to finish. You know, I am a weed management guy. I'm going to pretty much try to stay in my lane, but I know a lot of what we talk about from a weed management standpoint certainly involves a lot of other disciplines. And I think it's important just to stay up front. You know, cultural weed management, which really suggests a lot of things, but certainly it suggests appropriate variety selection and trying to put the seed placement in the best light for rapid and uniform emergence is a pretty effective weed management tool all by itself. A lot of growers that I work with on the high plains of Texas still rely pretty heavily on mechanical weed control, which I think is also a very effective tool. Now, there, of course, are some potential dangers to maybe some pruning and throwing too much soil to perhaps bury some blooms that you know needs to be avoided. But cultural control, mechanical control, you know, certainly physical control areas of the field where maybe some manual labor may be necessary because of maybe lack of effective options, or just, you know, a new weed that's not effectively controlled that looks like it's trying to produce seed. All of these things I think are very important. But from a herbicide standpoint, let's start with kind of this time of the year. If there are some early emerging weeds that are occurring, you know, I think it's critically important to make sure that as we're putting seed in the ground here in several weeks, that we're not starting with already weeds that are present. And again, mechanical control can be extremely effective there. We've got a lot of burn down chemistries that can be very effective, like glyphosate or various Roundup formulations that contain glyphosate. Gramoxone and the different concentrations of gramoxone that are available can assist us in starting clean. Lots of growers in this region are still relying on the use of dinitroaniline herbicides, and they're mechanically incorporating them, trying to uniformly place that herbicide in that upper inch to 2 inches uniformly, because those herbicides don't have much water solubility to kind of further move and be redistributed. So mechanical control is a very effective way to place some of these dinitroaniline herbicides. Some of these herbicides are also used at planting. You know, Prowl and Prowl H2O for some growers is probably as common or perhaps a bit more common than the mechanical incorporation. Prowl used by itself, PPI, or Prowl used maybe with some other chemistries to help broaden the spectrum of control. You know, Prowl plus Valor, Prowl plus a group of herbicides classified as group 15s. That's where your dual or S-metolachlors are. That's where the warrant chemistries are. You know, combinations that can be used at plant with the hopes of allowing that peanut as it's emerging to be emerging in areas that already aren't infested with some early emerging weeds. And as a principle, again, to effective, you know, crop production, I think the early season weed management is just so critically important. And it can be achieved in a number of ways, but certainly early inputs with herbicides that hopefully will keep later emerging weeds at bay or in check for, you know, the first 4 to 6 weeks. I think that timing is really critically important for us to get our peanut plants off to a good start. Todd, any initial comments or feedback there based on some of those initial strategies or thoughts?
Well, I think a couple of things. I think first off, if we go to talking a little bit about our burn downs, thinking about what weed species you have that you're dealing with and potentially what product you're choosing to make that burn down with. Obviously, if we have things like Russian thistle, we know that paraquat is much more effective on that. Depending on the planting timing, if we have some pigweeds that are emerged that are already resistant to glyphosate, again, that paraquat is going to help us there, versus maybe some other weed species, some type of grass or something like that, or if we're needing to burn down a cover crop, then that's where the glyphosate obviously is going to fit us better from a burn down option there. The second thing is on the yellow herbicides, especially if you're incorporating them with irrigation or through chemigation, the amount of water is extremely critical, 3/4 at a minimum to an inch. The other key to me is growers making sure that they're getting that 3/4 of an inch actually out of their system, center pivot system, and always all the way out to the end of the center pivot. I've seen some situations in the past where it may have been 3/4 to an inch closer to the pivot point, but as we moved out further on the tower, we had less actual irrigation that was coming out of that, and subsequently had less control out of our yellows. The other thing, and I think you would agree with me, we still get a tremendous bang for our buck out of our yellow herbicides. And if you do, where we oftentimes in our research have comparisons with and without a yellow, you can always tell the treatments that don't have a yellow herbicide to start with. And I think you'd probably agree with that, Pete.
I do agree with that, and I appreciate your comments. I think you kind of emphasized a few things that maybe I had skipped over. I think the activation of our pre-emergent chemistries are absolutely critical. They really do us very little good when sitting on the surface. Just thinking about all the different herbicides that are available, some of them a bit more water soluble, some of them can be activated with probably, 1/2 inch of water, 1/2 inch to 3/4. Todd, you emphasized, 3/4 to an inch for the yellows, and I fully agree with that. And really not just in the peanut world, but other crops where some of the dinitroanilins can be used. Again, I want to emphasize the point that you just made. I still feel like for what they cost, the help that we can get on annual grasses and small seeded broadleaf weeds is critically important. Now, sometimes I feel like I'm asked, the yellows, they just don't work like they used to, or we've got a bunch of weeds that are developing resistance to the yellows. And we spend a lot of time talking about weed resistance. The first question that typically I will try to kind of ask the grower who's making those comments is, are we still using those products at the same rates that we used to, or perhaps more importantly, are we still incorporating the way that we used to? Now, there may not be a lot of folks that are doing the double incorporation and the second one at a bit of an angle compared to the first one. But I still feel like, one thorough incorporation and not just relying on maybe a stalk cutter to kind of push that herbicide in, periodically. I think sometimes incorporation is a reason why maybe we feel like we're not getting the most out of the yellow herbicides when we choose to use them as an input. Last comment I'd like to make there, and actually I've got a slide that I've been using at county programs that I've done this spring. I've got an old data set that was shared with me from my colleague Wayne Keeling, some data that he collected back in the 1970s, looking at a bunch of different yellow herbicides at different times from fall to spring application. But the point mainly that I'm trying to share is there was never a time when we achieved weed control, greater than 90, 95%. I feel like the yellows have always been a good job to help reduce the pressure away from some of the additional inputs or foliarly applied herbicides and I wouldn't expect 100% control. But if I can control 7 out of 10 or 8 out of 10 Palmer pigweeds, to me, for what those yellows are costing from a weed resistance management standpoint, I'm now relying on my foliar herbicide to control far fewer weeds. And to me, it's really a numbers game. If I'm just controlling now 3 of 10, as opposed to needing to control, 9 of every 10 possible palmers that emerging, I think I'm certainly kind of delaying or kicking that weed resistance problem a little bit further down the road.
So Pete, I'd ask you, and I realize we obviously we want to encourage growers to incorporate the yellows as best they can, but I would still suggest even if you're just using a stalk cutter or something like that, you're still better off having that material out there rather than not. Would you agree?
I would agree. I think James has shared some data that using a power tiller may be the very best way to incorporate. I don't know a whole lot of folks in this region that are, incorporating quite to that degree. But I think thoroughly mixing that herbicide, again, cloddy soils are going to be a little bit restrictive, I think, to the overall placement of the yellows. You made the comment if we're using water to incorporate, although I would say water is not as effective, it's still far better having a yellow incorporated with water than not using a yellow at all. So, yeah.
So the other thing I might mention is that, and you kind of alleviated to that. As far as I know, we don't have any documentation of resistance in Texas or Oklahoma or the Southwest to the dinitroanilins. There are some documentations in some other states, but at least in this region. And it helps take some of the pressure off of the Valor or the generic Flumies. And we do have resistance to those products in some places. So I think that added benefit of taking some of that pressure off of that product, which I think is to me is really, really key in peanut production. It's probably as important to me right now as the yellow herbicides as far as a product to set us up. And so being able to take a little bit of pressure off that with the addition of that yellow, I think is a tremendous benefit also.
So I agree with all of those points pertaining to resistance. I'm also not aware now. There may be a little bit of a shift towards, a little bit maybe more hardy Palmer pigweed today that we're trying to control as to what we tried to control 40 years ago. But I've not seen any official documentation of resistance developing. And then you mentioned to Valor. Valor belongs in a completely different group of chemistries based on their mode of action. It's group 14. Maybe just a little classroom discussion. We use lots of chemistries that are based on group 14s in the peanut world. Things like Cobra, things like Blazer. Valor was mentioned, and there's other products as well. And we're starting to, I think, learn about some areas of the country that are now seeing maybe a few population shifts towards some weeds, including Palmer, that may now be a little bit resistant to that group. I've not seen that here, but because it's happening elsewhere, it certainly can happen here. We spend a lot of time surveying and trying to collect weed seeds and expose them to a wide range of chemistries just to see if we're starting to see a little bit of a shift. Todd, you mentioned it, and I want to reiterate it. I think Valor is a critically important chemistry for peanut growers, and most growers that I talk to seem to have a place for Valor at plant. So whether it's that yellow PPI followed by Valor Pre, or I know in James's part of the state, there's a lot of the Prowl plus Valor Pre that's being used. Kind of helps broaden the spectrum of control. Valor's pretty strong on Morning Glory. I would like to think that we can get a good 4 to 6 weeks worth of control. Maybe I'm a bit too optimistic there. 4 weeks of control from the Valor. And then, I think we're either looking for that overlay of an additional residual, or, we're probably geared up for some early post-emergent applications that are probably going to be used, or the choice based on the type of weeds that we're finding in our fields. So Valor, important chemistry. There's certainly some restrictions with rates, and I think 3 ounces is what most folks are using. Using that application within 48 hours after planting is still pretty clearly stated on the label. And I just feel like for the most part, Valor has been a proven product for many of us in the peanut production region. James, anything that you'd like to add based on the use of a yellow or Valor down in your part of the state?
Well, I tell you what, let me mention about burn down. Y'all was talking about burn down, and I've got some questions about Liberty. Liberty is not cleared as a burn down material yet on peanuts. It's an IR4 program. Hopefully next year, so will be. But anyway, no, I don't. Proud sometime I'll see misses on Texas Panicum. Sometimes it doesn't work as good on Texas Panicum as in other times, but overall Proud's an excellent material. Sunland, I always said, is a Cadillac of the yellow herbicides, but it needs incorporation, mechanical incorporation, and you just don't see that nowadays. Everybody it takes power tiller is an excellent way to go, but that takes too much time, and people just don't have time to spend on incorporation. So Sunland's kind of fell by the wayside, but it's an excellent yellow herbicide, that's for sure. I don't have anything. Go ahead.
I would agree, James, and we have seen, even though we don't think of Valor being a grass herbicide, we typically have seen a little bit of improvement when we include it with Prowl. So you can't put it out there by itself and think it's going to take care of Texas Panicum, but we generally see a little bit of bump in control of Texas Panicum when we add it to Prowl, which I think helps make up some of that loss that you're talking about that we see sometime.
Oh, I agree with you, Todd, about Valor. It definitely is not a Panicum product, Texas Panicum product, but it will definitely help out with Prowl for sure.
Yeah. The other thing, Pete, you mentioned 3-ounce rate and kind of talking a little bit. So I do have some experience with resistance in Oklahoma, especially in the soybean areas of northeastern Oklahoma. What we see is we don't see a complete loss of control with Valor, but what we see is a reduction in that length of residual that you typically see. And I think that's where we see those tank mixes with Valor help improve that, get us back to that 4 to 6 weeks, where we might be 2 or 3 weeks where we're into some resistance issues with that. And again, that's where that tank mix program, we just always see better control out of those as a whole, both on control and on the length of residual when we include something with it. The other thing is, I think as you bump that rate up to that 3 ounces, I think being inside of that 48 hours is critical. I think where we typically see injury problems with Valor is the closer we get to cracking and the closer that application occurs, and then that irrigation or that rainfall, washing that down on that peanut that's already started to emerge from the seed, some leaf development. I think that's where we increase our risk that we can see from Valor, and I think we've all seen that. But the closer we can be to at planting with that application, I think also helps us. Thoughts?
So I guess my thought, again, agreeing with what you're saying. I've seen some peanut response to Valor. This past year, I saw several fields, cotton fields, where I saw some response to Valor. That's a chemistry that we're using on the cotton side as well, 21 to 30 days before planting. I think in this particular instance, just maybe as a principle, I think maybe some of the rates were a little bit excessive. And in the field that I serviced, I think the application was probably made to dry planted cotton that essentially was watered up. So it really was a true pre-emergent chemistry. So I think sometimes when we kind of take that label and expand a little bit, I think there's certainly some more risks of seeing some of that response. Before we leave the yellows, and maybe before we leave the Valor conversation, I'm going to ask a question to my colleagues, and Shelley, of course, you let me know if there's anything in the chat. But once in a while, I'll get a question from growers that talk about mixing a couple of yellows together, and as opposed to using the full pint or two of Prowl or full rate of Trefland or Sonaland. They're thinking that maybe the combination of the two will be somewhat maybe synergistic. What are your thoughts there about using reduced rates but throwing those two different yellow herbicides in the tank together?
So I've never looked. Oh, go ahead, James.
No, I don't see any advantage of it, really. I think you're better off sticking with a full rate of one of the yellows then and going from there.
I guess my thought is I think it goes back to your original comment when we started was I think the issue is more about our incorporation than it is the definite product that we picked. So I think that's probably looking at how we can improve on that rather than tank mixing them. I don't really see, and maybe you disagree, Pete, but I don't really see what you're necessarily looking at with that combination.
Yeah. I would agree. I sometimes struggle, although I never want to argue with what growers are seeing. And if they're seeing some synergistic effects, I think sometimes we're not necessarily talking about a half rate plus a half rate. It may be something a little bit higher on both sides. So essentially, it's just a pretty high rate of a dinitroaniline that probably is providing the weed control as opposed to putting the two together. The other thing that always, I guess, concerns me in this kind of situation is if there happens to be kind of a product failure or poorer control than what we would expect. And as we then bring some of our, allied industry partners kind of into the mix because their product didn't perform as well, it seems like if we are using a half rate and a half rate, it's a little bit more difficult, I would think, to get some of those folks to come in and try to help in the situation that we're in. So, oftentimes I think there's a lot of chemistries that can be effective. I think on the peanut side, we still have lots of good options. And in this case, I think we have several yellows that we can use. Sometimes we make that choice also based on relationships that we have with industry, and using, those products at appropriate rates, I think gives us the best opportunity if something goes wrong to then call in some help to try to help rectify the situation.
Yeah, that's a great.
Okay. Go ahead,
Go
Todd.
ahead, James. I think that's a great. Oh, I think that's a great point, Pete. I think the other thing, when we start, especially if you start talking about pushing those rates with the yellow herbicide, the one thing we have to think about with peanuts that is completely different than most other crops that we have is, how you're going to do that, how much irrigation you have, or how much rainfall. Because if we do get into a residual issue at pegging, we can definitely hurt that early season pod set. I think a lot of times when we talk about injury with the yellows, we talk about root pruning, but with peanuts, I think it's more of a potential effect on pegging than it is at all on root pruning.
Yeah.
I don't know what you guys think.
I agree with you, Todd. I've seen Prowl put out at a 2x rate, accidentally 3x rate, and it burns off right at the pegging, at the ground line, the peg. So definitely could be an issue. One thing I was going to bring up about Valor, I'm switching back now. The only time I've seen Valor injury is under cool, wet conditions. That peanut plant is sitting there, it's not growing, so it takes up that herbicide a lot more. Also, adding Dual to the mix will definitely, Dual and Valor will definitely result in injury. And we don't see that in South Texas, and I think we plant later where our air temperatures and soil temperatures are a lot warmer, so we get the peanuts out of the ground quickly, and not like up in y'all's area where under cool, maybe damp conditions, that peanut plant might sit there for a while and take up the herbicide. So that's all my comments about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I
James,
think, oh, go ahead, Pete.
no, you go, Todd.
Well, I think you, Pete, and I think you've seen this out here. Definitely those cool, wet conditions, early planted peanuts, closer to cracking, and then get a big rain, which is also going to cool that soil off and maintain those cool conditions. And then probably where I've seen the worst injury is where that peanut emerges, it's stunted, and then we get another big rain that splashes that up on there, and you see that burn that would look similar to, say, a paraquat application, which is typical of that class of chemistry from a post standpoint. And again, I think that's why being closer to that actual planting date with that application helps both of those scenarios. Pete?
Again, agree. I remember when this chemistry first came out in 2000 or 2001, and that heavy rain that was occurring at ground crack really did cause a lot of that that burn on those young tender leaves. I think it was pretty significant in some other states. Oklahoma, maybe one, Georgia, another. I remember trying to bring that center pivot over the top and just kind of blast some of that treated soil. Sometimes when you try to induce injury, it's difficult to do, but I certainly saw plenty of pictures. And then, as you mentioned, even some follow-up intensive rain for kind of another splash and reach back at the chemistry, I think kind of set those peanuts back again. I want to talk a little bit about maybe varietal response, but not necessarily in this conversation. I guess I'm kind of ready to maybe think about the next step if we can. Hopefully we've gotten some good control as we've attempted to start clean, using our yellows, using our valor, depending on what, Mother Nature gives us. And other factors, likely we're going to see that second, that next flush of weeds coming. To me, there's a couple of different strategies. And I should have mentioned this from the beginning, and the growers on the call know this, but I feel better saying it. There is no one effective recipe to weed management. So much of it is, grower to grower and field based. Some strategies, some growers will use a strategy where they will attempt to overlay now kind of that next residual, try to rely less on maybe foliarly applied herbicides and just get that next residual in place. Opportunity to use Zidua or Anthem Flex in this manner. Active ingredient in Zidua is pyroxasulfone, which is also in Anthem Flex. And there are some restrictions on the peanut side, making applications post-emergence. The label will suggest maybe some greater potential peanut response if it's extremely early post. The label also will suggest to consult with local seed dealers to make sure that the variety that's going to be planted is tolerant to Zidua. I know as a group of weed scientists on the call, we've attempted to spend a little bit more time recently looking at differential varietal responses to the herbicides that we use. Again, I'm just going to turn the clock back a little bit. I know this happened when Strong Arm first became available back roughly that same time period, 2000, 2001. And I'm convinced it was very much of a varietal response that we saw, which pretty much has put a restriction to that particular chemistry for us on the high plains in a do not use region. I know James and other parts of the state still may have Strong Arm as an option, but up here it's really no longer an option. But back to the Zidua, and I've got some pretty good Zidua experience, as do my colleagues here. Zidua, in my opinion, well, first of all, it's a group 15 chemistry. So again, I'm going to group it somewhat similar to Dual and Outlook and Warrant, and there's others. Activity is only through the soil, so it's got the soil residual property. We can't use it as a true pre, like you might use a warrant, but we can use it for its residual properties after the peanuts are up until roughly the time of initial pod development. And in the peanut area, but also in other crops that I service, I tend to find, this chemistry being pretty consistent and very effective and having pretty good soil residual property. By itself, again, called Zidua, it's premixed with AIM or carfentrazone and Anthem Flex. But I still think in that formulation, it's primarily the soil residual activity from pyroxasulfone is the primary reason why that chemistry is being used. So we can overlay with a residual as long as I don't have that flush of weeds that's come, or we start to think about other chemistries that have foliar activity, and I'll at least mention them, and then Todd and James can correct me. But we've got these other group 14s, PPOs like Cobra and Ultra Blazer that are pretty effective, but really a lot of these annual broadleaf weeds need to be fairly small, and morning glories need to be fairly small. They do not have a lot of systemic ability or movement. And the bigger the weed and the poorer the coverage, generally the less control we can expect. I think if the weeds are small and coverage is thorough, I think we can, expect to get pretty good activity from those particular products. And then I'll also just throw out a very different group of herbicides that we can use post-emergence would be that group where Pursuit and where Cadre fit. And I separate those just because I think those are still effective chemistries for a lot of us. Although, rotation restrictions, and unfortunately, I think a shift maybe in some of our weeds developing tolerance to that particular group of chemistries is becoming more and more apparent. So we do have various options post, whether we're overlaying with a residual or relying on a herbicide that has post-emergence activity. Todd, James, what can you add to those comments?
Well, I'll just talk a little bit about Anthem Flex. Anthem Flex is not a standalone product. You need to put it out after the yellow herbicide. About 3 to 4 weeks after planting, it needs to go out. It's got AIM and Zidua. So AIM is to burn down the existing weeds, and Zidua to give you residual control. Some of the work I've done, if you wait too long, that pigweed or whatever broadleaf weed you got gets too tall, AIM's not going to control it. So you're going to be fighting maybe broadleaf weeds later in the season. But it's an excellent product. The only weak point with Anthem Flex is you definitely going to have to use a post-emergence grass herbicide because it's very weak on panicum and some of them other weeds. In our small plot research, I've never had Anthem Flex, Prowl plus Anthem Flex give full season annual grass control. It just doesn't happen. So if you use Anthem Flex, be prepared to put out a post-emergence grass herbicide. That's all I got, Dotray.
So a couple things, Pete, and this is part of the reason that I'm really big on the Prowl Valor up front is to hold those Group 15s till that early season application. Because we can use it in that where we can't really with the Prowl and Valor. So it opens up that window. We don't have a lot of great residual options there. So again, those fit that target also. I'd say the difference where I've seen is, and this is where we've really tried to push is start with Prowl Valor up front, and then come back with a paraquat and either Zidua, dual warrant, or the Anthem Flex to try to burn down any of that existing. We've had better luck with it than the AIM post, especially on careless weeds. And so we've had extremely good luck with that program first, and then just following that up and pushing that Gramoxone as late as we can. We don't want to let those pigweeds get too big. But the closer we can get to that 28-day after crack, I think the longer that residual out of those Group 15s help us. And that has really kind of set us up and helped us be able to clean up some things with some of our later post applications. The other thing is back to the Anthem Flex. that I think growers have to be aware of. That is I think it's I think it's a half ounce of AIM, where if we think about where we're using it in other crops, that's an ounce and a half rate. So it's not a great pigweed material anyway. It is an excellent morning glory material, but I think you're going to have to think about bumping that rate up, uh, or either again tank mixing it with gramoxone to get the control even on morning glories that you would typically think out of an AIM application.
Just Todd, let me just make my comments about gramoxone in South Texas. Anytime you use gramoxone in South Texas, you're going to definitely reduce peanut yield. In fact, the Syngenta people basically say don't use gramoxone on peanuts in South Texas just because it's too much of a chance of, for whatever reason, for our weather conditions or whatever, we always seem to have peanut injury when gramoxone is applied.
Yeah, and I guess, or go ahead, Pete.
No, you go.
I was going to say, we definitely have injury with gramoxone. We typically grow out of it and don't see the yield reductions that you guys see. So I tell growers, if you put gramoxone out, don't go back for 2 weeks because you're definitely going to see visual injury.
Oh, I agree with you there, but I'm talking about from the yield reduction standpoint, Todd.
Yes, sir.
And I don't have maybe as much gramoxone experience as you folks. I feel like I've used it plenty up till that 28 days after crack. There's several times when I have a hard time seeing any symptoms at all. We've played around with the with and without Basagran to Safin, and many times I can't even see the benefit there of the Basagran. Back to the I guess Anthem Flex. I think we're all on the same page here. The initial point that I tried to make was for the recipe of attempting to overlay a residual before the first residual breaks. I think there's opportunity to use the Zidua or that Anthem Flex. If the weeds are already up, then no doubt we're going to need something in there to burn down. And Todd mentioned gramoxone, and I would agree the amount of AIM that's in Anthem Flex is not enough, and it's going to need some kind of tank mix partner to provide the foliar control to where then that pyroxasulfone part can kind of kick in and hopefully provide additional residual activity well into the growing season. And then, eventually, if there's some later, emerged weeds, opportunities to maybe use, some AIM under hoods, or, folks that are comfortable using, the DB. I think there's other chemistries that maybe down the road, if we can maybe jump into another monthly call kind of mid-season, we can talk about some control of some weed escapes. But for now, again, that principle of starting clean and just being aware of the importance of the timeliness of that early post or post-emergent product with chemistries that are going to be most effective on the weed populations that we have.
Can I ask a question, guys?
Yes, sir.
This is Bob Whitney. I'm Anthem Flex. I've seen it put on just as soon as the peanut is out of the ground, and not even then, all the way up to 6 and 8 weeks later. I'm not sure I understand what you're recommending.
In our area, I would say 3 to 4 weeks after planting, Bob, because if you got, if you get those pigweeds or any broadleaf weed too tall, you're not going to have any control there with the AIM. And like Todd and Dotray mentioned, AIM's on lower rate anyway, so you run into that problem. So the only way I put it on later in the season if I didn't have a lot of weed pressure.
Okay, that helps. Yeah. I was thinking 3 weeks, but 3 to 4 is what you're kind of looking at, depending on weeds. Yeah,
definitely, Bob.
I'd say depending on weeds and depending on the early input and how long we would hope that input, if it's a tank mix with the pendimethalin and the Valor, maybe pushing more towards that 4 weeks. If it's just one of those two, then maybe a little bit earlier. I guess, Bob, the one comment I would make, and this is obvious, but I'm going to feel better saying it. Of course, we need to be carefully looking at these labels. I'm more familiar with the Zidua label than I am the Anthem Flex, but I'm going to make the assumption that the timeliness is probably the same in peanut. So it's kind of a crack first leaf as the earliest that application can be made. So it's not a true pre, at least not today. And then applications as far as that initial pod development stage.
Yeah, we started the Zidua out at crack. That was typically what guys were doing. And then Anthem Flex comes along, and so they've been delaying that. And that has probably shown more that we're not doing a good job with our pre-emerges. That kind of kicks into gear that we've got to do better with that to get to that 3-week or 4-week time period. So anyway, I don't know what the line is, James Gricker, for Gramoxone, but it ain't in Central Texas. It's further north of us.
Okay, well, definitely South Texas. Like I say, talk to Tony Driver and those people, and showed them our small plot research, and you dig those peanuts, and you can visually just see the less pods in the Gramoxone treated plot. So it's definitely a South Texas issue, Bob.
Thank you.
So one thing I might throw to, and again, to follow up on Pete, I think definitely that input up front affects that timing. You know, if you cut your yellow herbicide, say, in March or April and that's your only pre, then you're going to want to push the earliness of that, of any of those group 15s. But if, again, you follow that up with a Valor pre or your Proud Valor pre goes out pre, then I think definitely pushing that as far out in that window. But you know, if you're having an issue with it breaking, then you need to be earlier with that group 15, I would say. Wouldn't you agree, Pete?
Yes, I would. And just one other comment I guess I would make. I know some folks are trying to do some herbicide impregnating and slinging out some of these kind of Zidua types on ammonium sulfate or some fertilizer. I'm not sure how common that is on the peanut side, but certainly we've been trying to get a little bit more experience in that area, knowing some of our growers out here are using that as a delivery method for this particular active ingredient. I feel like some of our colleagues in maybe Arkansas, Tennessee, that is becoming a much more common practice. I have seen some pretty good activity with, you know, that impregnation. I've also seen where I was pretty disappointed. I think sometimes maybe if the architecture of our fields are still pretty kind of sloped, I think there's a chance when that dry impregnated fertilizer is slung out there can be a little bit of movement to where, you know, more of the herbicide may be concentrated on the bottom of the furrows as opposed to the top of the bed. Flatter ground, I think the opportunity for more uniform distribution is there. And to me, it's all about the distribution and where that herbicide is going to come off that fertilizer to where I would expect the weed control to be effective or ineffective in the case of poor distribution.
Could y'all make a comment on just minimum tillage, strip tillage, how that would affect your recommendations on your pre-emergence?
Well, definitely, I would go with Prowl H2O instead of Prowl EC, because Prowl H2O was developed for the no-till or reduced tillage market, where it will stay on the surface longer than the Prowl EC would for it. You need to incorporate. Not that it can stay out there that long, but, you know, depending on weather conditions, Prowl H2O probably 7 to 10 days. I don't know, Todd or Peter, y'all might have different comments, but that's definitely, I would use Prowl H2O instead of the EC formulation.
So for me, Johnny, I guess, I mean, a couple of things. One is, since, you know, 98+% of our acres in Texas are irrigated, that's not going to change that as much. Yeah, the Prowl is definitely a better choice from an irrigation or chemigation than a Sonalan or even the Treflan products. But it's not going to change as much. I guess the one thing is, I would probably make sure those applications went out after a strip till trip, you know, that way. And part of that's going to depend on your strip till rig also. But, you know, if there's any potential to bury that material deeper with your strip till, then you definitely wouldn't want to do that. So you'd want to be, again, probably a true pre-application with any of these. Wouldn't you agree, guys?
Yes. definitely.
Yeah, yes. And James, you mentioned that H2O is maybe going to, sit longer, less photosensitive. Also, the purpose of that formulation was to improve the water solubility of the pendimethalin. So should have a greater opportunity to move that herbicide in to where those weed seeds are germinating from.
So guys, it looks like we got about 10 minutes left. Is there any additional questions from the audience that you'd like us to address, or thoughts or comments from you guys?
Are y'all seeing any lack of availability with your pesticides? I guess I'm thinking like post-COVID or with the potential for tariffs. Is pesticide availability an issue at all?
I haven't heard of any yet, Peter, James. I mean, I think probably the bigger concern, I'd say probably a lot of that was maybe in place. A lot of those are produced, at least say 6 months or so before in advance. But I would definitely be concerned moving forward, especially because a lot of these products, it's not even the product may be manufactured in the United States, but the precursors to make the product come from overseas. So I think that's definitely something, that's a great point, and something people will probably want to be keeping an eye out, especially moving forward, and maybe even to some of the post products.
And should, go ahead, sorry.
Hey, it's Michael Newhouse. I think my video's off now, but I did have a question. We were talking about Prowl H2O, and I've always understood that it's to be used in no-till situations because it doesn't tie up on the trash or anything like that. But I've also, maybe I've been told wrong, but I thought that it had a 30-day, it would sit out there for 30 days before incorporation. We've always tried to use it on dry land, for cotton or whatever. And I just always thought that it had 30-day incorporation time.
Well, it probably does, Michael, but gosh, in South Texas, we get 90, 95-degree temperatures. You got 10 or 15-mile-an-hour winds. You got full sun. I wouldn't want to leave it out there that long before I tried to incorporate. That's my only comment.
And Michael, I think that's a great comment. My thought is, the trifluralin may say 48 hours. The H2O may say, 7 days or 30 days. To me, the clock does start as soon as that herbicide hits the soil. Yeah, the pendimethalin is going to last longer, but I would still try to get it moved in, whether mechanical or whether through use of overhead irrigation or rainfall as quickly as possible. This chemistry is pretty good in areas where maybe there's some, living mulch or even some dead mulch. But to me, that always is a little bit tricky because I feel like even though I'm not convinced there's a lot of that product that's going to be tied up, I think the final distribution or where those products lay, there is some potential for, maybe some gaps or holes. And because these herbicides are not tremendously water soluble, there could be opportunities for a few areas that may be somewhat herbicide free. So just, I guess, a general principle, the more things that are kind of restricting maybe where those herbicides end up, falling and resting, certainly can play a role in the overall effectiveness of these inputs.
Well,
Yeah, and
I
I
know
think
for us, like in a dryland situation, on say last year I had red top cane. We're going to go back in. We're not going to plant cotton on it this time, but typically we would. And we've always ran Prowl H2O, which it's more expensive. It's harder to spray. It clogs up nozzles. It's a very hard material to deal with, but we've always done it because we thought it bought us a bigger window. And I was like, man, I'm going to quit spending the money if it's not, if it's not as good. And
Yeah.
Anyway.
So I think James made an excellent point about the clock starting the day you put it out. And so, yeah, you may get a rainfall at 30 days and definitely get some activity out of it compared to not having anything out there. But the clock starts at 0 in two different ways. One, obviously the product breaking down, but also the weeds emerging. And if you don't get activation around that seed, And if those seeds have already emerged, once you get that activation, you're not going to get that control out of it either. So it's really that clock starting at, 0 on both your weed emergence and on your product. That's why some of our pre's, especially in dry land, we have some difficulty with them because the weeds emerge before we get the activating rainfall, even if there is some potential still to control a weed that hadn't emerged.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Last comments, James?
Dotray mentioned strong arm. Strong arm is not cleared for use in the Southwest. We've done some, Todd and Peter, y'all been involved in it. We still have issues with strong arm and out in the high plains in your area, Dotray, Todd, your area now too. South Texas, it works okay. I wish we had strong arm in our weed control arsenal, but it's just not happening. That's about all I got to say.
Right. Pete, final comments?
I mean, I'm hoping today's discussion was helpful. I think there's always some kind of specific and unique questions that folks may have, and I would just like to make sure that the invitation is there as folks start to put together their weed management program, and in peanut or other crops grown in rotation with peanut. I would certainly welcome to be a part of some of those discussions, helping identify the weeds. We know a lot of our weeds, but I don't think we know them all. There's always new weeds that are coming in. I think it's very important to know the pests before we can put together the most effective strategy. So, whether it's, weed ID or talking about various chemistries and how to put them in the best light, would just welcome opportunities for future discussions as we're getting closer to putting seed in the ground.
Thank you, Pete. And I would agree with that. Yeah, we're always available, all of us and all of the other research and extension people here at A&M, because in some cases it may be an individual answer to what issues you're having, or maybe why a product's not working as well for you. And we're always, it may help us develop a research point that we haven't thought about. So we're always excited. Again, I'm excited to be a part of this. I hope this has been useful to all of our listeners, both today and future listeners that will tune in. And hopefully we can continue this, and it will be beneficial to our peanut growers and our industry out there. So with that, I'll throw it back to you, Shelley.
Hey, I just want to thank everyone for joining us. It was a great inaugural event, right? So thanks to everyone. We're going to be back with you guys again on April 18th. I think Johnny Kaysen, Dr. Johnny Kaysen, we all get to be friends, and then it's just John Kaysen, right? Sorry, John. Dr. John Kaysen will be our speaker on 18th. It's a small family. We just call each other by our first names, right? So we'll have a show lined up for you on the 18th. Let me know how we can improve the show, how we can reach more people. I'm excited. I appreciate you, Todd. Pete, thank you. James, thanks for hopping in. Way to go, guys. Thank y'all. We'll see y'all again next month.
All right. Thank you, Shelley.
Have a great weekend.
You too.
Thank you.
Wreck 'em.
Wreck 'em.